No precious. Okay, I think this is where I thought we might need to review before we progress on to today's lesson, even though I'm really hoping that even if you're seeing it kind of piecemeal, at some point you'll put the two things together, because if you're not paying close attention, it looks like I'm weaving in and out of topics, and I am kind of weaving in and out of topics, but what I'm trying to build here is kind of a tapestry, so that when you take a step back from the details, that you see this beautiful picture of resurrection. Last night we looked at Matthew 16:28, because we're talking about taste. I'm trying to hopefully set you up to have a new insight into a passage from this week's Torah portion, which is Vayetze. And there's this strange incident where Jacob cuts down 3 young trees, 3 saplings, and he peels them. And then he sets them up at the watering holes or the watering troughs. And somehow seeing these 3 trees provokes the flocks and the herds to reproduce according to the color pattern that's going to be beneficial to Jacob, not to Lavan. And so that's always been a little bit mysterious. Even if you look in the rabbinic sources, there's a lot of mystery there. And so anytime we can find some little shred of a clue, I think it's good. And so maybe we have found a shred of a clue this week. And sometimes I think these clues are really only evident if you're willing to put together the Tanakh and the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah. Sometimes the picture's only there if you've got both of those sections to put into that tapestry. So we're talking about death. Again, going back, the fruit in the garden, she saw that it would be tasty. It would be good to taste it. So Matthew 16:28, Yeshua says, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And this was kind of a mysterious statement in itself. Apparently, some of the disciples expected that some of them would not die until Yeshua returned. They kind of had it, they're like every other generation. We think it's right around the corner. And this guy's really clingy right now. But they did die. But Yeshua said, even if they did die, he says, there's some of those standing here. And I would assume that he's talking about those among his disciples, those among his followers, his believers, that they would be the sum who were standing there. And he says they're not going to taste death. And then Yeshua, he tells the parable right before he makes this statement. He tells the parable of the rich man. Well, it depends on which gospel you're reading, I guess. But he talks about how the rich man died and was buried in Luke 16:22. But as he's talking about Lazarus, the poor man, that he's taken by the angels to Abraham's bosom. They had 2 completely different experiences at death. The point that Yeshua seems to be making here is that the 2 people, even though they're both Israelites, they experience death differently. If you experience death like the rich man, then you're tasting death. However, the poor man's experience, Lazarus' experience, was completely different. Apparently, he wasn't tasting it. He might be dead, but he's not tasting death. His experience is completely different than the rich man's. And so we go back into the Greek word for taste. What is Yeshua driving at here? When we look that up in the Greek, and it kind of means what we just said, to taste, by implication, to eat something or to experience it, either for good or bad. So to taste something in this context, he says it's to experience it. It's how you experience it. How will you experience death? So then from there, once we found the Greek word for taste, then we can cross-reference and we can go back into the Gesenius and find what is the Hebrew cognate for this Greek word. Is there a Hebrew word that will help us not just understand what Yeshua would be saying in Hebrew, but he's always referring to something back in the Tanakh. He never just speaks randomly. If you follow the clues, he will always lead you back to some place in the word where there's a precedent, where there's a first mention, where there's a progressive mention. So we find this Hebrew cognate only once. And it's right here in Genesis 25:30. It's going back to Toldot. It's going back to the conflict between Jacob and Esau. The prophecy, the older will serve the younger. Last night, we took that back to the sixth day of creation and how the beast is the older, but the man is the younger of the sixth day. They are both sixth-day creatures, and that's the number of both beast and man. They share the same number. What distinguishes them? Well, as we saw, it was their kind. It was their mean in Hebrew, not like mean as in cruel, but a Hebrew word, mean, meaning like a species or a kind. So the moving beasts, they were to be after their mean, after their kind. And it says, then, okay, now the creation of man is different. Even though it's the same day, the creation is different. Now he is in the image of Elohim. He is not after the mean of the moving beasts. And you could see that later when the beasts are brought to Adam in order to name them. He can't find anything like himself. There's nothing corresponding to him out there. And so the woman is formed from him. But here's the context, Genesis 25:30. Again, that same dynamic from the proto-prophecy of the day 6 of creation. Now we have the older and the younger, Esau representing the beast as the older, and Jacob representing the younger as the spirit that's breathed into the man. And so Esau, the older, the soul, the beast, says to Jacob, the spirit, please let me have a mouthful of that red stuff there, for I am exhausted. Therefore, he was called Edom by name, because of course, Edom means red. Adamah is earth. He's an earth man. Jacob's the spirit man and Esau's the earth man. And you can see there in Hebrew how many times Edom is used in the verse. Mean, right? From that red stuff, but it's a play on word. The species, the kind of the red. It repeats it. Min ha'adom, ha'adom. And then it says down at the end, karashmo, Edom. Therefore, his name is called Edom. So you have three uses here of Edom. And they're not necessarily resurrection threes in this case. It's showing you what kind of appetite that Esau had when he says, give me from the kind, give me from the red stuff. The word that he uses, that is the Greek, the cognate to the Greek, is haliteni, and it literally means to devour like an animal. Devour like an animal. Esau, you can see how he's deriving his name in this little verse right here, because he's basically telling Jacob, the spirit, we're talking in symbols here, Jacob, the spirit, feed me like I'm an animal. That's what the earth says. That's what the earth man says. Feed me like I'm an animal. The spirit man does not eat that way. The spirit man has a different method for distinguishing what is food or how to eat food. So the shoresh of this word, to devour, la'at, and you can see that the preposition that it always has to be followed by is mean. Hebrew verbs tend to have a particular preposition that according to the rule, you're going to use it, like the Hebrew verb to help, la'azur. Well, you're always going to use the lamed, which is to or for, if you're going to use that particular verb. So if I were going to say help me, I would say azorli, help to me, if that makes sense. And so in this case, the preposition that has to be used is mean. And that's what Esau is saying right here. He's saying, na, please, mean, ha'adam, from the red stuff. Haliteni, mean, the red stuff. Feed me like an animal from the red stuff, which again, it goes back to the species, the mean, or the minim, plural, of the wild beasts on day 6 of creation. And that's the heads up for when we get to the book of Revelation and it starts talking about the woman riding the beast and the mark of the beast and so forth. You have to have all this background for that to be completely meaningful for you. So let's go back to Genesis 3:6. Sweetie. It says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took some of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband with her, and he ate. Now, look at the Hebrew phrasing here, if you can read it. If you can't read it, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I've put in bold print or bold font what I think are the critical words for you to take away from that passage, because we want to compare it to truth. And let's go to the truth first. It's in Psalm 34:8. It says, taste and see that good is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And I did that literally. You can turn it around, it doesn't change the meaning. I wanted to do it as literally as I could. So taste and see that good is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. So it's going to be Uru Kitov. Uru Kitov. So experience and see that good is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. That's the truth. If you were to taste him, if you were to experience him, then you're experiencing life. There's life in him, not death. But what the woman saw, vetireh, it's the same verb, to see. It's used here in the feminine singular. Vetireh ha'isha kitov ha'etz. That's not the truth. It says when saw the woman that the tree is good. So that what I'm asking you to look at basically is 3 words. Vetireh kitov, that is not true. The tree was not what she thought it was. It was not good. But if she were to taste Adonai, that he is kitov, right? So it's a matter of, you have to be able to see what is good. You can see and taste life. But the woman, she didn't taste it. You see the difference there? She didn't test what she was doing. We're kind of putting this in the context of last night's lesson. What does it mean? How are we supposed to be wise? It's through a patient acquisition of the information. And she did not do this. Basically, she stuffs it in her mouth. Because this is how Esau is asking, feed me like I'm an animal. So Psalm 34, the truth, is using ta'am, which means to taste. It's not the same word that Yeshua used when he described experiencing death. When he says taste death, that's not the same word. The word he used was to devour like a beast. You won't taste death. You might die if you're a believer, but he says you will not experience death. Psalm 34:8 says, taste something to see if it's good. In other words, don't be greedy. Don't be an animal. Don't say, feed me with some of that stuff, like Edom said. Ta'am means to examine it by tasting it. Perception. And typically, if you're going to taste something, you tend to sniff it first. Remember, your sense of smell is associated with spirit, reach, an odor. And if it smells bad, then you tend not to want to put it in your mouth. You put it through this examination process. So even sniffing can be part of the tasting. It can be like the pre-taste. And if you don't like the way if it doesn't pass the sniff test, then you don't put it in your mouth. You don't actually eat it. So in a sense, what the psalm is saying, do your information gathering. Taste the Holy One. Don't animalistically devour the fruit of death. Because what Edom does, it substitutes another tree for the life-giving food of heaven. It substitutes a different kind of beauty. It substitutes a different kind of wisdom than what the Holy One created you to exercise. But ta'am is spiritual perception. You are supposed to taste to find out what is good and what is life in Yod He Vav He. And here's a for instance. Proverbs 31:18 says that the valorous woman tastes that her gain is good. This is different from the woman, Babylon. In the book of Revelation, she's got all this commercial gain. She's got everything you can name in terms of commercial gain, but it's not tasty in the realm of life because it's being destroyed. It was the result of animalistic devouring of human souls. But see, the valorous woman of Proverbs 31, she represents the Holy Spirit. And instead of just animalistically devouring everything, she tastes, she experiences that which is good as it is defined by the word. She's interested in spirit food, not animal food, if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense to me. I don't know if it's always making perfect sense to everybody else. So in Genesis 3:11, Adonai says, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree from which I commanded you not to eat? In other words, did you animalistically devour something instead of tasting to see what life is? Tasting, using your spiritual perception to analyze what is death and what is life. And so if you put that back into the Hebrew, put a little red arrow there for you, if you're not sure where it is. It says, Vayomer, mi higid lecha ki erom ata hamin ha'etz. Did you eat from the tree? And you see the play on word there? Min means from. Did you eat from the tree? But min also means species. Did you eat of that species of tree is the play on word. And the preposition, if you drop down a line, you'll see that it's levilti. All right, it's Well, let's run back up to where we were. Let's not jump ahead to that. Hamin ha'etz, right? So the swallowing like an animal that we went over, that Esau says, feed me with some of that red stuff, feed me like an animal. Remember, the preposition it has to take is mean. All right, it's the same thing here with the tree. Did you eat from the tree? Did you devour this fruit like an animal? Did you eat from this species? And this is not the first time we have seen the word mean for species. If we back up from the sixth day of creation and go back to the third day of creation, then we have in verses 11 and 13 of Genesis 1, oddly, 2 accounts of the trees. 2 accounts of the trees. And what are we looking for here? The repetition of mean for species, which is the play on word mean from. And you can see where they would get the word species or kind from the preposition mean, or vice versa. I don't know which came first. It's chicken or egg question, I guess, from the Holy Tongue. But if something is from something, it's from that kind. It came from somewhere, in other words. But look at these 2 different accounts. And Rabbi Lux pointed this out to us a couple weeks ago. The first account is in verse 11. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit according to their kind, with seed in them. And it was so, right? So we can see that there's fruit trees on the earth. And those fruit trees bear fruit according to their kind. They're going to reproduce like themselves. They're going to breed true to their kind. Now, watch here. Why do we need a second account? There's really not much different information in the second account in verse 12. The earth produced vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a third day. Right, so we've got slightly different descriptions of the trees, and they're both good. You know, it says God saw that it was good. The first kind of tree is good, and the second kind of tree is good. We're not sure what's going on here, because again, if we put this back in Hebrew, it's describing 2 different kinds of trees. It sounds like it's saying the same thing, but it isn't. When it says fruit trees bearing fruit, it's saying that the tree itself was a fruit. The whole thing, the bark, the insides, the branches, the leaves. Remember where it says in Revelation that the trees will be for the healing of the nations? It says they'll bear fruit every month, but it also says the leaves will be for the healing of the nations. That's odd, which there's a little play on their word there too, because one section of a Torah scroll is called a leaf. But it also has the tree of life written on it. But get your mind around this. This first kind of tree he's describing in the garden is completely fruit. It doesn't matter what part of that tree you eat, it's all fruit, and it also bears fruit. So whatever the fruit we think of would taste like, the rest of the tree would also have a similar taste. Now, the trees in the next verse are a little bit different. They're trees like we see them. There might be trees out there that the whole tree has it's edible and it has a a taste. I mean, they do taste, they just don't taste good. But for the most part, any tree that we eat fruit from, we don't eat the leaves, we don't eat the branches, we don't eat the bark, we don't eat the insides out of the tree. We might drain the sap out of a maple tree, but that's probably as close as we get to the tree as described in verse 11. And they're both bearing according to their kind. They both have seed in them. But the first tree is clearly a superior level of tree than the second tree. So they're both reproducing after their kind or their mean. And of course, that mean is going to be stated 3 times. 3 is the number of resurrection, and he states it 3 times on the 3rd day of creation. So it's like resurrection, resurrection. Plus tree, 8's spirit of counsel. It's associated with resurrection. That's why the pagans probably took it and twisted it into worshiping poles and trees and things. When we get over to day 6, it's going to say 5 times that the beasts, the moving beast, reproduced according to their kind. So it seems that just as there's 2 kinds of living souls on day 6, that there are 2 kinds of trees on day 3. Mind-blowing, isn't it? But because we've got these 2 accounts of the trees, we've got fruit trees, literal fruit trees, and then we've got trees bearing fruit. And the implication here is that the tree from which Eve and Adam ate had somehow rebelled. It wasn't conforming to the first kind of tree, the tree as it was originally created to be. This kind of tree is only going to yield fruit, but it's lost its complete taste. Possibly prophecy. Again, something that Yeshua might teach about later, something that Paul might teach about later. But the inner part of that tree, by the way, and I don't know what it is in English. I know bark, I know sap, but I'm not sure what the inner part of the tree is called. In Hebrew, it's referred to as levan, which means white. Like there's a purity inside of a tree, no matter what color it is, it's white. And at least symbolically, it's showing us a tree that somehow lost its complete taste. It can still yield sweet fruit, and that's good. But it's not entirely sweet and pure in its white inner part. Now, last night we mentioned salt as being part of this covenant, how you had to sacrifice salt with the beast because it represented not just seasoning, but a preservative to transform within. Whatever transformation took place in your soul from bringing that animal, the salt was added to say, okay, let's preserve this. Let's not let this wear out. We don't want it to lose. We don't want your soul to lose its saltiness from this repentance, from this change. You were supposed to change from the inside out. You were supposed to be like this first kind of tree, from the inside out. So let's look at those 3 trees that Jacob deals with in this week's Torah portion. And I would say, well, let's do this first, and then we'll come back to it. I'm not sure why I put this one first, but for some reason I did. Exodus 16:31 goes back to the manna. It says, the house of Israel named the bread manna, which if you're reading that in Hebrew, it doesn't say manna, it says man. And it's spelled exactly like mean or species. If you just take the vowel pointings out, you just have to know what it is and pronounce it properly. But without the vowels, it's exactly the same as mean. It's taking us back to these proto-prophecies of Genesis 1, where on the third day and on the sixth day, and also on the fifth day, where things are reproducing according to their kind. And it says it was like coriander seed white. Oh, maybe that's why I did that. Okay. I'm trying to help you make the correlation here between the white poles, the inside white of the tree, and Yeshua. So the manna, who Yeshua said, I am the bread of heaven. He's the manna. He is the man. It's kind of a play on word, even in English. He's the man. But its color is going to be like coriander seed, white, levan. And its taste was like wafers with honey. Now you see that word there for taste. It's not the animal kind of devouring. It's the spiritual kind of tasting. It's taste and see that Adonai, he is good. She checks her merchandise. She perceives, she tastes that her merchandise is good. It's spiritual increase. It's spiritual reward. It's not the commercialism of Mystery Babylon. So these are the key words when we look at the manna, which was rained directly out of heaven. Apparently it came directly out of the garden. So they called it man, and we know that it was levan, like the inside of a tree. Would you consider not being in my lap just for a few minutes? Thank you. And if you could taste it, we know that some people, they didn't want to taste it. They didn't like the taste of it because they weren't really tasting it. They were eating it with animal appetites, like Esau. But if you could taste it, the tamu, it was like wafers with honey. Well, not so coincidentally, they're going to a land flowing with milk and honey, and honey is thought to have filled one of the rivers of Eden. And so what did you taste in the man? And the white, the purity of the man? You tasted a little bit of the Garden of Eden. You were being nourished from the Garden of Eden directly. And so I went ahead and I took the vowels out of that. And again, it's wordplay. And if you take the vowels out, it could read like this. And the house of Israel called his name Man, because he was like seed of a white troop, and his taste, his ta'am, like wafers of honey. And if Yeshua said he was the bread of heaven, I think you'd be pretty well okay with reading that into it. It's just, I think it's too coincidental otherwise that Yeshua was identifying himself as coming from the garden. So now let's get into Jacob's three trees from Genesis 30, starting in verse 36. It says, he put a distance of 3 days' journey, there's our resurrection number, between himself and Jacob. Remember the difference between the rich man and Lazarus? You couldn't make that journey. The rich man didn't think it was that far, but there was a great gulf between them. And the difference there apparently had to do with resurrection. You know, who is on the resurrection eligibility list? Lazarus. Who is in question? The rich man. And so Lavan puts 3 days distance between them. So it's telling us, it's sending a message of resurrection right here. And it says, Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob basically takes a remnant. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar. The Hebrew word for poplar is livneh. You can see there the word for Lavan. So this is the second use of Lavan in the passage. Lavan's flocks, and then poplar, livneh, and almond, which in Hebrew is luz. Remember our lesson on Jacob's ladder and Beit El and Luz, and how Luz is thought to be the resurrection bone. If you look at the menorah, it has the almond blossoms in it, representing the resurrection. So we have poplar, almond, and plane trees, and peeled white stripes in them, exposing the white that was in the rods. Do you see how there's more than is needed in terms of information? And when that happens, it's drawing attention to something. And so I put in bold, if you can't read the Hebrew, so at least you can recognize the letters. How many times the Lavan, Shoresh, ends up in one verse or two. Well, actually just one right there. So you've got Lavan, the person. You've got Livne, the poplar rod. And you've got the Levanot, the white stripes. And then you have Halavan, where it says exposing the white that was in the rods. And that's on top of naming Lavan. So it's all about showing us what's inside the tree. It's all about putting it in the context of resurrection. So we've got 3 days journey. We've got 3 kinds of trees. And these 3 kinds of trees are somehow going to motivate the flocks to reproduce their seed in abundance. And the Luz is the resurrection bone. And so Jacob is establishing a prophecy here of not just a regeneration, but of a tree generation, taking us back to the garden, that from him will be descended trees of righteousness, resurrected trees of righteousness that are completely fruit. Not just Lavan, white, like the scheming Lavan, because the scheming Lavan could look white on the outside, but inside he's scheming about how he's going to get your stuff and get rid of you. Not necessarily in that order. So like Yeshua was saying last night of the salt, let the source of the salt be from the inside. Let your outward words and works come from the interior white, not the exterior white. Be the fruit tree, not just a tree bearing fruit. Be completely transformed by the Spirit, by tasting, to see that Adonai, he is good, not by animalistically devouring the things of the earth, the products, the commercial products, the foods, the wisdom of the earth, which it turns out is not always wisdom. And then there's even more play on words here. If we take it back to the garden, we're talking about 2 different kinds of species. Back here, Jacob is putting a distinction between the kind of Lavan and his flocks and the kind of Jacob and his future flocks. Jacob's, he wants to reproduce as being fruit trees instead of trees bearing fruit, the better kind of tree, the better kind of resurrection, we might say, of the 3rd day. So where it says in Genesis 3:11, have you eaten from the tree from which I commanded you not to eat? Right, and I put the Hebrew text down there for those of you who can read it. But it's this particular text that the rabbis say wicked Haman's name appears. May his name be blotted out. He appears again in the book of Esther. His ancestor Amalek appears, and of course Saul fails to kill him. And he says, what is this bleating of sheep in my ears? Kind of takes us back to Jacob's flocks, where he peels the rods down to the white. He says, I want completely white offspring, completely pure, completely transformed, completely resurrected, completely seasoned in their covenant from the inside out. And so again, if you take the vowels out, you can see why the rabbis say this is, through the wordplay, the first mention of Haman from the book of Esther. Wicked, may his name be blotted out. It says, Haman is the tree from which I commanded you not to eat. I commanded you not to eat. And in this case, we can see why so many times human beings in scripture are referred to as some kind of tree. Even Yeshua heals a blind man. He says, what do you see? He says, I see men like trees walking. What kind of tree are you is the question. Have you reproduced according to the kind of Lavan, the fake white? Have you reproduced according to the kind or the type of Haman? And you see there the play on word, Hamin, ha'etz, from the tree, according to the kind of the tree. Not did you just eat from the tree, did you eat that kind of tree that I commanded you not to eat? So we've got Haman the tree, may his name be blotted out. He is a kind of a type of species of created beings that they've been around since the garden, cooperating with the serpent to deceive mankind with man or food. If we eat of his fruit, then we rebel against the first, the one who commands us. Adam and Eve were commanded concerning the tree. The question Rashi asks is, why would they listen to the serpent or the tree? The serpent or the tree, neither one of those created the human being. Why would you listen to a beast or a tree? So instead of conforming themselves to the image of Elohim, doing that patient testing, exercising that kind of wisdom, instead of tasting to see that Elohim was good, they behaved after the kind of the beast of the field. They fed themselves like animals. They devoured without tasting the goodness of Elohim, because he alone determines what is tov and what is life. So the suggestion here is that possibly this tree of the knowledge of good and evil was of the kind that was a tree bearing fruit, but perhaps not a fruit tree that was completely fruit. It's kind of a mixed up tree. The fruit was sweet, but the white part, the bark, the leaves, they weren't completely fruit. But when we get to the book of Revelation and it talks about, in this case, the leaves, the very leaves are going to be for the healing of the nations. They'll be able to eat from the fruit tree instead of from the tree bearing fruit. Try and say that 3 times. So we've got Yeshua. He is the man. He is the manna. He is the species from which we eat. He's the food of heaven. He's the word. But rebellion is Haman. Ha means, see, ha means the. The adversary always wants to think he's the man. But as it turns out, Yeshua is man. He is the food of heaven. Haman or Hamin, these are not of the kind from which we eat or should reproduce. And so we are commanded to erase the memory of Amalek from the earth. Haman was an Amalekite. So at this point, it probably feels like we've gone a long way away from the figs and the grape blossoms of Pesach, but we haven't really. We're still talking about trees. And as it turns out, once they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, strangely, Adam and Eve select fig leaves with which to cover themselves. It seems that if the leaves of the fig tree were good to eat, then maybe they wouldn't try to be using them as covers. It seems like there's a problem there, that things that weren't designed to be covers had somehow become covers. And with the blood of the lamb on the lintel, the blood of the lamb on the mezuzot, they're related by sacrifice, they're related by covenant. And we know that the time of the figs and the grape blossoms is at Pesach, the time of the blood covenant of the lamb. And we know that the meal in ancient times and even today can seal an agreement between parties. I mean, people still go do a business lunch if they're trying to strike a deal. It's very ancient. A meal can be part of a covenant. It can seal an agreement. And this is why Adonai taught through the sacrifices to bring that blood to the lintel and the doorposts. He's saying, I want you to purge away Edom. I want you to purge away Haman. And I want you to establish Yeshua as the man of heaven. Don't eat like an animal. Don't eat like the beast. Don't eat like the red one. Don't be Babylon, the woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Don't do that. And pick the right trees. Reproduce according to the right tree, because Yeshua would be a completely Levan, tree of righteousness. He would be the tree of life. He would be the fruit tree, not the tree bearing fruit. And if we eat of him, then we can reproduce according to his kind, according to his mean, as the man of heaven. So Yeshua teaches about these footsteps of Messiah in Matthew 24, kind of coming back into the practical realm of things with the sign of the fig tree, although I don't notice that practical. But let's get back to our text of Song of Songs 2, and we'll look at verses 10 through 13 to get the full context of where we've been going with the trees and Elijah and Joshua and Moses and Aaron and Eleazar and the parables and all that. It says, arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. For behold, the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. The blossoms have already appeared in the land. The time has arrived for pruning the vines, and the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in our land. The fig tree has ripened its fruit, and the vines in blossom have given forth their fragrance. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. And I would like to think that the fig tree blossoming, which we know is Israel, if there is fruit ripening, it's because she is on the verge of becoming a fruit tree instead of a fig tree bearing fruit. She is about to have a complete transformation of the Holy Spirit. But what I want to do, let's arrange it in a chiasm, because the advantage of doing that as a study tool, if you see, oh my goodness, this looks like a chiasm, then go ahead and arrange it, because once you find the axis or you find the middle of it, then you've found the essence of that particular passage. So it's in the same order. It's just that we've arranged it as a chiasm. So you can see the first and the last verses, they're identical. If you see a verse and then another verse not far from it, which it could even be chapters in some cases, but in this case, it's not separated by much. You can see, wait a minute, I just read this. And wait a minute, I just read this. These become your bookends. And you can look ahead. You can look behind to see, is there any more matching phrases? If it doesn't look like there's any more, then you have found the bookends of the chiasm. So what we're calling A, those match. And so now it's a little more of a challenge. Now we've got to kind of telescope in and say, okay, where are the matching phrases within these bookends? So we take, for behold, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the blossoms have already appeared in the land, the time has arrived for pruning the vines. And then the matching is going to be the vines in blossom have given forth their fragrance. And that lands us right in the axis. What is he trying to tell us? So the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in our land. The fig tree has ripened its fruit. Now, those are two verses or two components that are very consistent with giving us a season, the Passover season, the springtime. But then folded into the season where we know the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in terms of, the mating season, the season of love. We also see the fig tree has ripened. So we've got a really good idea, again, what the season is and what is expected to happen in terms of the fig tree and its fruit. Where do we go? Let's go back to the winter is past. And again, winter is going to be stav in Hebrew. They can be a little bit different. Like in modern Hebrew, if you say winter, a lot of times you'll say choref. And if you're talking about the fall, the late fall, you would say stav. But biblically, stav is referring to that winter time, the rainy season, the darker days of the year. And the root of it means to hide. So there are things that are hidden in the winter time, in the dark season, and the rainy season. Okay, so when we found our bookends, arise, we see that as a command. And that command is to the beloved of Adonai, arise. When do they arise? Well, they arise after stav. They arise after the winter. They arise after the rainy, dark season. And in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew 24:20, this is the Evan Bohan translation translated by George Howard. And I'm not real happy with his translation because sometimes he just skips stuff. He just leaves it out like it's not there, but the text is actually there in Hebrew. Not sure what his point is. It could be that he was working with conflicting manuscripts, and when in doubt, he left it out. But this verse in English is translated, pray to God that your flight will not be in winter or on Shabbat. In Howard's translation, he left out winter. He just puts, pray that your flight be not on Shabbat. But if we're going to match it to our Song of Songs text, then seeing that it's stav or winter, because stav is what's in the Hebrew text of Matthew, it helps us to match the two ideas that Yeshua is giving us in terms of our preparation for his footsteps. So he says, Hitpalelu le'el, pray to God, shelo tihiyeh, that it will not be menuset, it's got chem on it, menuset chem, bestav, obeshabbat. All right. So he's saying, what you want to pray for is that you're not one who is fleeing in the wintertime, in the dark season, and that you are not one who is going to flee on Shabbat. Okay. And the explanation, I think, is found in flight. Yeshua would not expect his disciples to flee. His disciples are expected to arise. Remember, he's quoting from text they're already familiar with. If he says stav, then they're going to think, no, wait a minute, where have we heard stav before, when he says, pray that your flight be not in winter. Well, they're going to connect it just the way that we did with the Song of Songs, with a particular passage in the Song of Songs, where it says the winter, the stav, is past, arise. So he says, pray that your flight would not be in winter, because what's supposed to happen after that winter is past, you are supposed to arise, not flee, arise. And so they've got a context already. It's in the context of Song of Songs, a book of resurrection. So Yeshua is saying, you need to look into coming up into that realm of the clouds of glory. And he goes on and he talks about it here in Matthew 24. We'll get into that more maybe next week. But from these two verses below, Psalm 7:6 and Psalm 68:1, you can see what their expectation is when Yeshua says, pray that your flight be not in winter. Pray that you're not the one fleeing at these times. I expect you to arise, not to flee. You are to arise with me, not to flee with the enemy. Because it says, arise, Lord, in your anger, raise yourself against the rage of my enemies and stir yourself for me. You have ordered judgment. May God arise, and may his enemies be scattered, and may those who hate him flee from his presence. So what's Yeshua saying? Pray that your flight be not in winter. If you are fleeing in the wintertime, again, it takes us back to those days of darkness in the 9th plague, where it's thought that the unripe figs were harvested out, and all that was left was the remnant that were willing to leave Egypt. He says, pray that your flight is not found in this dark season, in this hidden season. Because those who flee are his enemies. And in fact, it's from these two verses that we get this blessing that we say every Shabbat in the synagogue when we get ready, taking the Torah out of the ark and taking it on the processional. Which we do it in Hebrew, but it's when the ark would travel, Moses would say, arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let them that hate you flee from you. For from Zion will go forth the Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Blessed be he who in his holiness gave the Torah to his people Yisrael. A little slow there. All right, so at some point, the Torah will go forth, and it's going to be the enemies who will flee, who will scatter, and you will be gathered into his presence. You will come closer while they flee. So you would never consider fleeing on Shabbat. And he says, pray for that you would never fall into that mindset, that you would never eat so much of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that you would be confused about Shabbat. Instead, arise with Adonai. Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered. Arise with him. And so these first figs that Yeshua says, I want you to learn from the fig tree. In the Hebrew Matthew, it's verse 32, Matthew 24:32. We know the first figs in Israel ripen in late April, just after Pesach, or around the time of Pesach. Might be a little bit early, depends on the year. But typically, you identify the ripening figs with Pesach. And that first crop will continue ripening until sometime in June or around Shavuot time. That would be the time to arise. But there's also a late crop in September, which is around the time of the fall feast. It may not be of the same quality. But Yeshua told his disciples to learn from the parable of the fig tree. He says there's something about the fig tree that's going to help you with this. So he says, now learn from the parable from the fig tree. As soon as it's branch has become tender and sprouts its leaves, you know that the summer is near. Right? So you know that the early growing season for figs is near. And the Hebrew Matthew helps a little bit more because it's kind of the power of that statement is lost in the English translation. In the Hebrew Matthew, it says, me'etz hatana, me'etz hatana, or from fig tree, learn the parable. You see the emphasis there? In the Hebrew, his emphasis is not just on learning the parable. He says, I want you to learn the parable from the fig tree. Learn the parable from the fig tree. The fig tree will teach you the parable. It will throw you back into the garden so that you can learn there what how he's telling you to prepare. The fig tree will function in that way. It will actually become like a teacher as you prepare. And so I actually even set it up physically so you can see how the Hebrew text is set up. I just put it in English because there's strange spacing, and they preserve the spacing in the Hebrew manuscript. The spacing is odd. And so I went ahead and gave a literal translation from the fig tree. Learn the parable when you see its branches and leaves sprouting. And then there's a space. There's another line. It drops down a line. You will know, for. And then it drops down another line. Close is he to the gates. And remember, one place you put the mezuzah that distinguishes you from the living, moving things outside the house, outside the temple. That's the mezuzah. It's the sign of that covenant. This is what distinguishes us. And you'll also have to reach back a little bit to a lesson we did on the Jewish expectation of Messiah and how they expected that Mashiach bar Ephraim, he's also called Mashiach ben Yosef, same person. Well, that is misspelled. It says to defeat God. It should say Gog. I think this spell check thought I must be crazy that there was no such thing as Gog, but he is expected to defeat Gog, not God, at the gates of Jerusalem in order to usher in the time of Mashiach ben David. Right? So he says, close is he to the gates. If you can learn from the fig tree, you will know when Yeshua is close to the gates. You will know when the wrath of the Lamb is near. You will know those footsteps, and you will remember the expectation that Mashiach bar Yosef, Mashiach bar Ephraim, is close to the gates of Jerusalem in order to defeat Gog with his faithful and to usher in the kingdom of Mashiach ben David. You see how just kind of knowing a little bit of their expectation in the background, it helps us in terms of what were they expecting and how is Yeshua addressing those expectations. So those verses 29 through 30 set up Yeshua's teaching of the fig tree. And we know the fig tree is Israel. And then we read in verses 29 and 30, and I suspect it's the same verses with your English translation. I'm kind of looking at the Hebrew Matthew, but in English, it's at that time, after the tribulation of those days, the sun will grow dark, the moon will not give forth its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the host of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the families of the earth will weep and will see the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven with a great host. That's the question. Who is that great host? Could it possibly those who arose with Messiah instead of fleeing from the sight of the Torah and the wrath of the Lamb? He says it's a great host and with a dreadful appearance. What is that saying in Hebrew, I think? Yeah, Norah. So it's dreadful as in awesome and with an awesome appearance. So compare this with the passage we looked at last week, as we're looking at how the unripe figs represent the unrepentant Israelites and how they were equivalent expressions with stars that fell. So Revelation 6:12 says, I looked when he broke the sixth seal. You see how it's taking us back to the man and the beast on the sixth day? He's breaking the sixth seal. And there was a great earthquake, and the sun became as black as sackcloth made of hair. That takes us back to the ninth plague that the rabbis say was also a time that the unripe figs were picked out of Israel. Whereas the righteous ones or the repentant ones, they had light in all their dwelling. It says the whole moon became like blood. The stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. This tells you that there's a judgment going on within Israel. And so those Israelites who could not hold their place, they were unripe at the time of figs, they fell to the earth in the darkness. They had lost their witness because the witness is in the stars. The stars witnessed on the fourth day to the Moedim. The sun, the moon, and the stars, it says they were placed in the heavens for the sake of the Moedim. These are stars who have lost their witness. They've lost Shabbat, they've lost Passover, they've lost Shavuot, they've lost Sukkot. And more importantly, what those feasts represent in terms of submitting to the Holy One and his commandments. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the eminent people and the commanders and the wealthy and the strong and every slave and every free person hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountain. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So you can see it's blending there, the darkness, the 3 days and 3 nights of darkness, a darkness that's so tangible, you can't see your brother. But you also see people seeking out darkness and saying, hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne. Well, remember what Stav is? Wintertime. You're supposed to arise out of the darkness with Yeshua. And Yeshua said, pray that your flight be not in winter, that it not be in darkness. And here you have the unripe Israelites falling from their witness in the darkness. And then he's going on, he says, in the families of the earth, is what Yeshua said. This lists them a little bit different, kings of the earth, eminent people, and so forth. They're begging, mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne. They want to be in the dark. They know the wrath has come, and they know they can't stand. So we know from our last lessons that the unripe figs, the young figs, the unformed figs, these are the unrepentant sinners among Israel. And you say, well, wait a minute. If they're Israel, why are they being judged? Because there are many who call themselves by that name, whether through faith or birth, who nevertheless, they're not repentant. It doesn't mean they're not Israel. It simply means that it looks like they're going to keep eating from a different kind. They're not willing to change their diet. And so Yeshua is warning to us that we should pray that our flight be not in winter. We shouldn't be the ones trying to hide in the mountains and the rocks and the holes in the ground. When Yeshua comes, we should be part of those who have arisen with him while he is scattering his enemies. We shouldn't be fleeing on Shabbat. Shabbat should find us where it always finds us, resting according to his commandments on Shabbat. Instead of fleeing from his presence, we are resting in his presence on Shabbat while his enemies are fleeing from us. And then Yeshua goes on, he says, woe to those who are nursing children or pregnant in those days. Well, remember, the stav, the winter, it's a time of hiddenness. And so if somebody is pregnant, then she's like that unripe fig. She's not given birth yet. She's like that nursing, the nursing children. The figs just aren't ready. They never matured. Apparently, they had time after time after time. They should and could have matured. And they're still either completely hidden in a pregnancy or still nursing. And they're not going to be able to hold on in that time of darkness. It's like they're going to be shaken, like unripe figs in the leaves of a fig tree, be shaken off. And so we'll need to stop here, I know. But I want to give you some, not necessarily homework, but I want to give you a follow-up from Isaiah 28, verses 1 through 13. And I kind of cheated a little bit. I put in bold print the things I thought would be of interest to you based on this little mini lesson that we've done over the last couple weeks on the footsteps of Messiah. And see how Isaiah 28, 1 through 13, how Yeshua is echoing these words and how John is echoing these words in Revelation. With everything you know so far about the footsteps of Messiah. And incorporating, like Yeshua says, pray that your flight be not on Shabbat. Well, down here in verse 12, it says, this is the resting place, but they would not listen. This is the place of quiet. Give rest to the weary. They wouldn't listen. So that's just something. I'll leave it up there a second in case you want to take a screenshot, but you'll have it on the recording where you can pause it and take a look at it, or just copy down the reference of Isaiah 28, 1 through 13. And you might read it in a different translation. It might be even more meaningful in a different translation. But this is what I mean by Yeshua never just spontaneously throws something out there without any context whatsoever. It's our job to find out where he's preaching from. Okay. And just to add on, I will be going to HRN next week to to continue recording the 7 abominations of the wicked lamb. We're going to try to get through as much of that as we possibly can. Get through those, the trumpets and the bowls and the thunders and so forth. We're pretty much, we've waded through the 7 seals pretty well. So
you're still recording.
Yeah. Oh, that's good, because I want the people listening on the recording to be aware that there might be schedule changes. Well, there will be. There's no might be. There will be schedule changes over the next few weeks because our route, we're going to have, I'm going to stay long enough to do our class Monday night next week. So Monday night will not change next week. But Tuesday we'll be on the road all day going down to Loosedale. So there will be no Tuesday class. The following week, it's liable to be the reverse. There would be no Monday night class because I know I won't have Wi-Fi unless I go to somebody's house. But on Tuesday, I'll probably invite the Tuesday class into the studio with me again. And so whatever I'm recording at that time of day, you would be sitting in on that with me. It'll probably look a little strange, from my laptop instead of a produced program, but it's fun to have you guys there in the room with me because it's very boring and lonely in a studio talking to yourself, which Nikki's there, but she doesn't care. She's thinking of the technical stuff. And so after that, we're going to continue recording. I possibly want to start a new series based on what we've done with what's behind the Western Wall, the Aaronic benediction. I would like to get Nikki to help me to produce that into a really fine, nice programs. Because if you remember, I had trouble with bringing the recording in for the Aaronic benediction, but see, she's got the tools and the technology to do all that. So we will be there until probably the 1st of December, and then we're going to go up to Bill Cloud's and celebrate Hanukkah with Bill and Brandon and Melody, and I think they said Paul Wilbur's coming in on the 5th to do praise and worship. So there's no bad days in that schedule. All good stuff. Would love to see some of you guys if you can make it down to Jacob's tent for Hanukkah. And then after Bill's, we'll drive on back home. And then we should be back on our normal schedule. But I'm going to do my best to either invite you into the studio or try to beg my way into somebody's house that has Wi-Fi. And they're pretty nice folks down there. So I don't think I'll have to beg too hard. I'm pretty sure I can, I'm pretty sure I can talk my way into Mark and Tammy's house if nowhere else. So, and again, I'm about to turn this recording off, but I just wanted everybody to be aware, watch your emails because some of you don't. And I understand why. We talked last night about cutting down on electronic noise. But if you get online and nobody's there, then that might be why. So check your schedule. And I'm going to do my best to stay on schedule as much as possible. And because I've scheduled so much time, I don't have to record every day. That means I won't have to worry about talking too much or I'll lose my voice. That's always been that factor. Like, can I really teach and record at the same time? And this way I can take some days off in the middle and it rests my voice and it can stay strong and so forth. So it'll, in the end, even though it'll upset our schedule a little bit, I don't think it'll be adverse to our study. I think it'll be good for our study. So I am going to stop the recording now that I've given my fair warning.